Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Flinders University's Meet the Minds lecture. Today's topic is called Cultural Diversity and Sex Education, catering to all young people in our classrooms. My name's Alan Sickolo, and I'm from the Flinders University Meet the Minds team, and I'm really excited today to be hosting today's event as we explore cultural diversity and sex education. To begin with, as always, I'd like to acknowledge that we are hosting this forum on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge and convey our deep appreciation to the elders of all the nations upon which Flinders operates. This event is delivered as part of our Meet the Minds lunchtime lecture series, where you get to meet some of Flinders University's most engaging minds as they bring you their latest research from a diverse range of fields. And today we're really fortunate to be hosting Dr. Monique Mulholland, who is a senior lecturer in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences right here at Flinders University. Monique's research is focused on gender, sexuality and young people. Her projects have included the influence of pornography and the pornified media culture on young people's views of gender and sexuality. She also works on projects into intergenerational conflicts between young people and parents in migrant families, and more recently, the whiteness that underpins sex education guides available to parents. As always, we're really keen to make this an interactive event with a live Q&A session, so that's your chance to participate and ask questions in real time to Monique as she delivers her lecture. We do ask, however, that everyone please treats this forum as a place of respectful engagement, where people are treated with dignity and where differing views are tolerated. We are ready to start receiving questions, so please feel free to use the chat functionality in the Teams platform. But without further ado, it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Monique Mulholland. Over to you, Monique. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that generous welcome. And in addition to the acknowledgement that you've given that we meet today on the lands of the Kaurna people, I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous lands across the country on which online participants are meeting. Also, before we start, I'd like to give a really big shout out to Tessa Opie from In Your Skin Consulting, who I know is online today with us, who does amazing sex and relationships education work across the country and has been my co-collaborator in this project for several years now, and also to Yana Gomez, who has been doing amazing work on this project with us. Also a shout out to the wonderful Fida Sanjakta from Monash University, who has recently come on board and is also online with us today. So as Alan mentioned, my research focuses on gender, sexuality in young people, and in particular much of this has been undertaken in South Australian schools across a number of areas that sit in the curriculum areas of sex education and sex and relationships education. And from here on in, I'm going to call this SRE because, as you can hear, it's a bit of a mouthful. And today I'm going to speak about a current project that can better account for cultural difference in this space. But for those unfamiliar, it's worth beginning with a super brief overview of what is covered in sex education and sex and relationship education, SRE. Topics include reproduction and pregnancy, contraception, STI information, and more recently, consent, respectful relationships, gender norms, gender inequality, and sexual diversity. It's worth noting, however, that this does not happen on a uniform basis by any stretch of the imagination across schools. Some schools might only cover the first few topics on bodies and bits and pieces, and some might venture more into the broader issues around negotiating sex and relationships, or in fact some might not do any, as is often the case. So over the time that I've been doing this work, a nagging question that has come to emerge rests on the fact that students in our classroom come from a range of cultural backgrounds or are newly arrived migrants. So really the guiding question for this project is SRE meeting the needs of the diverse range of young people in our classrooms? Which students are best served by this education and which continue to be sidelined and marginalised? And indeed, this nagging question is well established in international and national literature. Firstly, current research has noted that young people from refugee and newly arrived migrant backgrounds do not access sexual health services as readily as their non-migrant counterparts. And as such, SRE education that meets their needs becomes all the more important. Current literature also states, and this in a way doesn't need stating, that our populations are diverse and that therefore our curriculum needs to adjust to better account for cultural and religious differences. But why does the curriculum need to adjust? Some current research, of which there's not a lot, steps out the problem that sits at the heart of SRE curriculum. I'm particularly inspired by the work of Mary Lou Rasmussen, who argues that SRE content prioritises consent, choice, respectful relationships and valuing sexual diversity, aka the list I just talked us through. However, this list assumes that these priorities will be uniformly accessible and understood by all students. Despite the underlying justification that SRE is progressive and evidence-based, it nonetheless rests on a secular logic based on individualistic frameworks of sexual freedom, autonomous choice-making and human sexual rights. However, because SRE favours individualistic approaches, it does not explicitly address collective concerns and thereby the complex role of kinship networks, culture, religion and spirituality in students' decision-making. And it also overlooks the fact that notions of choice and freedom may not sit easily with all students. They're contested terms and ideas. So by extension, relying on these logics misses the ways in which choice and choices are shaped by a whole range of factors that emerge through migration, negotiating relationships with parents, negotiating norms from home and new country. So in short, as foregrounded by a fabulous large-scale study, which is really my go-to study in Australia, that was undertaken in Australia and New Zealand, again by Mary Lou Rasmussen, who I've mentioned, with Louisa Allen, Kathleen Quinlivan and Fida Sanjakta, who I also mentioned, whiteness and Eurocentrism sits at the heart of SRE. And in a country like Australia, this matters because a culturally embedded history of whiteness continues to establish the white Anglo citizen as the normative subject of nationhood and national identity. Now, there's a final problem noted in the current literature. We know that SRE is not cutting it, but how do we redesign content and curriculum? Some literature argues that teachers need to be more culturally sensitive, which of course is true, but this is problematic and assumes they can easily capture all the needs and experiences of students, or that students can easily be known, as Louisa Allen argues in a paper that came out of that large-scale study. Or as some of my earlier work has noted, there is a danger of simply tacking on or adding on these experiences in an oversimplified way. Identities are complex, they're constantly in flux, and as we are aware from recent attention on intersectionality, and some will be aware of that and some won't, it's a bit of a buzzword, but really that just says that identities are made up of a complex mix of factors such as race, class, gender, sexuality and ability. And so as a critical race scholar, I'm deeply nervous of projects, actually, such as this project, that assumes that just because young people are from different cultural backgrounds, they will necessarily have different needs than their Anglo-Australian counterparts. The danger is that this can fall into a long history where white Eurocentric scholars, white scholars such as myself, stereotype and assume too much about the needs of culturally different others. But despite these concerns, I'm convinced that we need to find out more from young people by genuinely centering their voices, which are too often ignored. So to bring these insights gained from the current research that exists back to our project and the presentation today, I feel particularly strongly about this last point about how. How can we translate these insights into better strategies, better resources, better programs, better curriculum tools that teachers and educators can use to enliven difference, to give it some room to breathe rather than close it down? So to account for difference without assuming too much or oversimplifying it or assuming students can easily be known. So not an easy task at all to a deeply tricky theoretical problem and problems and deeply tricky institutional constraints such as the limits on teachers' time and curriculum overload. And if there are any teachers in the room, I can probably see and hear you groaning or nodding your head because you have a lot to deal with in classrooms. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So to explaining the project itself, we are interviewing young people from 18 to 25 who were not born in Australia but went to secondary school here. We've completed 9 interviews with young people from Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Iran, India and Bangladesh, and we want to conduct 10 to 15 more. And indeed, if we get more interest, of course, we will do more. All of these young people went to public high schools bar one, and most have lived here for approximately half their lives. And we asked open-ended questions that centred on three main themes, and they're quite open-ended because we wanted them to bring their experiences to it without us assuming too much, as I said before. What was covered in SRE at school? What did they feel was useful? And most importantly, what needs and experiences were overlooked, and what did they feel were the best ways to teach this content to better suit their needs? So we're halfway through and very happy to come back when the project's completed and talk more, but we've got so much already from these 9 interviews. So, and this is what I'll talk to you now, what we've found so far. So firstly, on a very basic level, the young people all argued that SRE too narrowly focuses on pregnancy, STIs and contraception, so the bits and body stuff. And they wanted more information on broader issues around negotiating consent, masturbation, LGBTQI+ and transsexualities, more information about pornography, and more discussions about pleasure, as one young man said, talk about how it feels, feelings, confusions. And what I particularly like about these insights that I'm just going to start with is that they mirror findings from large-scale evaluation studies over many years with students across the country. So large-scale studies which have urgently stressed that SRE is lacking in these areas. So this foregrounds again the similarities between young people from migrant families and their Anglo counterparts, and counters any assumption that different cultural backgrounds means always and necessarily different points of view. So really all young people are saying this, please talk more about pleasure and the stuff that actually affects our lives. However, more specifically relevant to this project in terms of cultural and religious diversity, they all unequivocally argued that it spoke to white students, or using their terminology, Aussie kids or students from westernised culture. And this phraseology is really interesting, I think, because they are Australian now. They've lived here half their lives, if not more, but don't always see themselves in this light, which is really a whole other set of conversations, and I've written on this elsewhere. But it's interesting to note that. As one young woman said, and I don't always read out quotes, but I like this so much that I will. As Lan said, there are more kids and teenagers from other cultures. Australia is such a multicultural country, and a lot of us can't relate to that information that's been given to Australian kids, and you need that inclusion. Obviously, there are so many programs for inclusion, but you just don't feel it that much because you feel like the Australian people approach race from a very Australian perspective. Like you have certain assumptions and expectations for people from other cultures and their parents, but you really don't know. They need to speak to a lot more culturally diverse people to be able to have a grasp or an understanding for how to approach sex for kids who are not Australian. They are Australian, of course, but interesting, they present it in a way which I think gets at the heart of the problem, that they don't see themselves in Australia, or they don't see themselves represented. And I haven't put this quote up, but Devon, who was another participant, also stated they should have more variety. They're coming in with a more Judeo-Christian and Western perspective. Some specific ways in which this whiteness or Australianness played out was not seeing their issues represented. For example, there was no mention of arranged marriages in SRE or sex ed, no mention of negotiating marriage or dating partners outside of the cultural group, which was big for some of them, or religious rituals and practices around periods. There were also too many assumptions, such as assuming young people are comfortable to ask questions in class. For example, several participants stressed that in their home country, talking about sex was taboo, not just with family, but also with friends. So as Devin says here again, I didn't even know where to start to ask. It wasn't that I didn't want to, I didn't even know where to start. Assumptions that even basic knowledge is brought into the classroom. For example, assumptions that parents may have already covered some info, like why is hair coming out, or what is masturbation or wet dreams, or basic info about periods or the birds and the bees, or what gay and or LGBTQI+ sex or sexuality actually is. So assumptions that there's already some knowledge. And I want to really stress here too, and I think this is important, that some parents of participants were actually open. So we're not saying this is the same for all participants, but in the ones that I've done so far, the majority weren't. Assumptions by parents that young people should go home and talk to their parents about issues or can take them to services, sexual health and STI and sexual health services of various kinds. Assumptions that every young person in the class is open to LGBTQI plus issues, and for some this was confronting. But actually, I've just spoke to some of the findings. This isn't what was most interesting to me. What is most interesting to me and to us were their practical suggestions for how to account for difference in the curriculum. Across the interviews, they pointed to some fascinating early insights that might lend themselves to practical strategies we can think with. And I really want to stress at this point that these suggestions do not offer straightforward answers or solutions. However, true to the spirit of the project aimed at centering their voices, we feel it's important to start here, so with their voices and ideas. It's something to think with. So firstly, they all stress the need to shift from content delivery to finding out more via student-initiated questions without putting people on the spot or making them feel judged by others in the classroom. As Lan says, I haven't put Lan's quote up here, but Lan says, acknowledge there are different questions. It's so fascinating because you can't cover all the information as an educator, but you can directly answer your students' questions, like directly help them. And as Reza says, I'll let you read that quote here, but I like the way that he just alludes to the fact that people say, oh, it's a safe space quite easily, but it might not be a safe space for all students. To this end, around finding out more, they suggested really practical things like the integration of methods such as online surveys or anonymous question boxes so the teacher could find out more. Several participants suggested more one-on-one time with counsellors or teachers if they didn't feel, or at least an invitation to do that if they didn't feel comfortable to talk in class. Another idea, which probably happens in some classrooms, but was to set up small group sessions, possibly friendship-based, where kids would feel comfortable to ask questions rather than direct their questions to the whole class. Another practical suggestion from these young people we've interviewed so far revolved around the need for culturally specific, culturally tailored information, drawing on community experts and voices. As Reza says, the quote is up here, every culture is different and a lot of teachers wouldn't understand. So teaching about that stuff is really not easy. So some practical suggestions were making or sourcing videos from experts from different cultural communities so the information is culturally appropriate. One participant suggested that this means the teacher doesn't have to feel nervous then about knowing everything, or mitigates the risk that the teachers can know or speak for community issues or experiences. Another participant suggested a website portal, and I've put this quote up here because I actually think this is an awesome idea, expensive but awesome, and maybe we can tackle this in the questions at the end because you'll probably be thinking already that these are great ideas but they take time and money. But he says potentially, and I don't know if it would be possible to tackle numerous cultures, but I'm just visualising this website and there are different areas and there's like the Middle East and Africa and Europe, and there are 5 different videos under each subheading from people from those backgrounds. So he says this is like an extra resource so that kids can go home and click someone from their background and that actually empathises. He says, I don't know how doable it would be to do this, but I think if I was at school and there was a 5-minute video by a Muslim Middle Eastern person or a Baha'i person, you would feel so included, you would feel special. A further practical strategy was based on the need for a broad range of good quality resources about sex education, SRE and sexual health services. And this is probably not wildly new to those of us that work in the area. We need good quality resources. But this was interesting for this project because they noted that they found most of their information around SRE by Googling, not from class content, but didn't always know if the material was good quality. So they more specifically, they wanted resources on trans and LGBTQI issues. This was particularly true for one young man who said that he was very confronted about this issue because of his religious beliefs, but if the resources were there, he said, he would have explored them and this would have helped him think it through. They also wanted information about how to approach sexual health services solo if it's not possible to discuss or go with parents. A final suggestion was to develop a cache of existing expert voices from community that can be called on for class discussions or that students can be directed to. So similar to the website portal idea, pulling together what's there and possibly making new material. A final practical insight rested on the need for more diversity represented in content and SRE material, but I leave this to last on purpose really because it's the most tricky, theoretically and practically. With regard to broader representations, they all recognised it was impossible to include the experiences of all young people, but nonetheless did not let go of the idea that seeing more diversity meant they could at least imagine themselves in. So at least trying, or at least thinking about how to do it. So some ideas included shifting from a reliance on images of white people in relationships or white families, and Alan mentioned earlier that I did some research on parent guides that are given to parents for talking to your kids about sex, and they were really obviously all the images were white people and white relationships. So not using images but random symbols, which I thought was very interesting. Lan says that, you know, I don't want it to be targeted towards every single culture, and it can't be, she was saying. So if you want to target everybody, just have images, random images or symbols, or just words rather than images, real life images. Represent more complex intersections, not just culture. As Padma states, SRE doesn't consider many diverse perspectives, not even just multicultural, but like regional, rural, metro. There are individuals from different areas as well that don't get the same knowledge or exposure. Still to this idea around more diverse representations, one idea one of the participants suggested was to produce a really general video for use in SRE content that just names it, that just names there are multiple experiences of sex, sexuality and gender norms that are shaped by all sorts of differences, cultural and religious differences, rural, regional. And this video, so then what I love about this video wouldn't be about including everybody's experience, but at least reveals the elephant in the room right up front and names it. So then it shifts the ground for the students listening. It makes them realise straight away that we're all different. And actually this participant said that this video could somehow include all students, Anglo, you know, what they call Anglo-Aussie kids as well, so that we're all seen as different, not just those seen as cultural others, which often happens when we want to think about difference. It's always the cultural others. Use more relationship dating scenarios other than what Padma called bar dating, which was completely different from anything he'd experienced in his culture. Or as Lan notes, I read so many scenarios of like, what could you do? Meet your boyfriend, bring him home to your parents. And she says, I'm 24 and I'm not kidding you. We've been dating for 4 years and my boyfriend only met my dad last week. So there wasn't such an openness to being able to bring the boyfriend home. And this boyfriend was also outside of the cultural group, and that was a bit tricky for her. So to speak more openly about a broader range of issues young people might be negotiating and tackling in relationships, such as dating outside cultural groups, or how to navigate and express intimacy if sex doesn't occur until marriage. So a whole range of things. And finally, use a value line exercise or some other kind of exercise that doesn't start with content but starts with broader values such as respect or consent, and then allow students to bring their diverse experiences to this. Again, this is tricky because people might not want to be put on the spot or talk about their views on those, but it's one way we can think about it. So in conclusion, this talk, I think, has actually raised more questions than answers, which I actually think is always a good thing. There's a slippage between young people wanting more diversity without being put on the spot, alongside a recognition that you can't include everything. And in addition, many of these suggestions, as I say, take time, money and careful thought, but this is what the HOT project hopes to build. And in particular, and I'll let you read this now because I've just looked at the time and I'm slightly over time, but I think, as Padma says, redesigning any kinds of materials needs co-design. You need to do it with young people. You need their voices and their inputs. They need to be right at the forefront. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monique. That was really insightful. We are starting to get a few questions through from the viewers, but to get things started, I'm actually really keen to understand how young people actually respond to this type of research. Were they enthusiastic? Were they embarrassed? How did you engage them, and what was their response?
Great question. Well, interestingly, because this research was just interviews with people that were self-selecting and came forward, they were not that embarrassed actually, because they already knew what it was about and they wanted to speak about it. So they tended to be a particular kind of young person, and that's going to be really important to set up when we write this up, that we didn't capture the voices of all sorts of young people, some of which who may not have been comfortable. We captured those who were already comfortable. And in fact, I like that question because it allows me to say that I actually prefer research that is undertaken in institutional context with a broad range of people who may not even be self-selecting, but for a range of reasons we couldn't do that this time. But in this case, they were comfortable and they were open. And I also find that because of my long experience working in this area, there are ways of setting up conversations and discussions where even those that aren't used to thinking through the issues can be more comfortable. But in this case, they were certainly not that embarrassed, and they were happy to speak about it.
Wow. And we've got a question that's come through, someone that's anonymous, saying that they're curious to know whether the participants from the recent study from Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Iran, etc., if there's any suggestion that they may not need a different sex education for some topics. For example, was there a topic where a secular viewpoint was actually fine?
Yes, I think that the biological stuff, so the stuff around, we just want to know about the issues around reproduction, sexual, STIs, contraception, and so that, but also it is true, like one participant said, I was actually really fascinated to, even though I wasn't, from his cultural background, he wasn't used to thinking and talking about LGBTQI issues. But he said, I loved the opportunity to just think about different ways that relationships occur and happen. And he also said too, I'm just trying to remember if I can think of his exact words, but he said, he was the fella that talked about bar dating scenarios. He said he actually liked that. He wanted, he noticed that his wasn't included, the ways that he might come to a relationship, but he actually liked listening to other kinds of relationship scenarios.
Got two other questions have come through. It's certainly sort of related. Do you think there's appetite in schools for addressing these sometimes confronting information? And I guess the question is, what's the school's appetite and what challenges are there in improving the SRE? But the other question, which is similar, is why is it that SBS can screen 100 vaginas while classroom teachers have no access to good resources?
Oh my goodness, I love that. And can we have another 20 minutes or half an hour to answer that question?
We'll have to get you back.
Look, I just think, I'm just going to say it, I think that I've been doing this research for a long time, but and schools, there's often a backlash when schools undertake programs that want to talk more openly with kids about sex and sexuality, like, cultural difference aside. And there's often panics about, will that harm young people? What will the parents think? A kind of risk aversion around allowing this research to get off the ground. And I do think it's true. I think the Christian right has been very clever in lobbying, and they can get themselves organised around programs which which allow young people more agency to talk about sex, such as the Safe Schools program, which occurred, I can't exactly remember how long ago now, but there was a massive backlash and that got closed down. So I think this kind of work is always dealing with those kinds of constraints, which is a generous way to put it, where you want to do this and you want to give young people more voice, but there's these fears and panics around what parents will think, and will it harm young people?
So it's a bit of a significant cultural barrier. I think we definitely will need to get you back once your research is complete. The comments have all mentioned that this is a fantastic topic and really interesting research. And I guess just to close off, last question, what advice would you give to someone who might be considering a research career in this field that might be listening today?
I think the advice I would give is of course you start with a research question or a research idea, but be prepared to be surprised and be prepared to not get the answers you expect, because exactly going to those first few questions, you know, I'm just kind of hypothetically here, it might have been easy for me to say, oh yes, all young people just want to include everything about their culture in the curriculum. And some said, no, we didn't. But we also still know it's not speaking to us, but we don't necessarily want it to be included for all sorts of reasons. So I think be prepared to be open to what the people you work with, like to give them real agency and really listen to what they're saying, and then be prepared to you know, massage your project around that rather than have really fixed ideas in the first place, especially, and this is especially for research, true for research, where a white Anglo scholar is doing it and working with issues of difference. It's particularly important to kind of check yourself and be prepared not to know and to listen.
It's great advice. Thank you so much, Monique. It's been a really fantastic discussion and really insightful presentation. And thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And we wish you all the best with the outcome of this research, and look forward to getting you back once it's complete. I'd also like to thank our audience for their questions and inputs and interest in this event. It's been a really engaging conversation. And also remind everybody that you can watch this session again on the Flinders YouTube channel or Flinders University Meet the Minds webpage, where you can also register to receive notifications on our future events. Speaking of which, our next Meet the Minds lecture is on the topic of popular genres as Trojan horses. This is a lecture will be held by Dr. Alex Vickery-Howe and Dr. Amy Matthews on Monday, the 15th of November at 12:30 p.m. And we hope you can join us then. But again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Monique, for your time today. Have a good day.